measure we put in place to help everyday New Zealanders with their companies. Thank you very much.
David Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that member, Mr. Benny Hill, my colleague referred to him as, has taken his seat. It was an embarrassing speech and an unfortunate contribution. He tried to convince us there at the end that this government had a good record on business issues. And he read out a list of supposed achievements there. He neglected to mention that this government has the worst economic record of any government in the last 50 years. The worst economic record of any government in the last 50 years. Shocking. 1,000 people a week leaving this country for Australia. 50% increase in the number of unemployed. 3% drop in the median wage. And the biggest gap between rich and poor that this country has ever seen. Shameful contribution. And worse than that, the big ideas have been things around taxes on paper boys, cleaners. And these things have actually increased compliance on business and increased the grey tax market. We know that the regulatory impact statement, for example, for their paperboy tax policy, said they hadn't even consulted businesses. They were expecting businesses to keep records on part-time cleaners in a way they never had before. They increased compliance costs in a miserly move to get a few extra dollars because they aren't making ends meet. The tax take has dropped under this government because the economy has stalled. The economy has been growing at a rate slower than the growth of population in this country, Mr. Speaker. This government has an embarrassing record on economic issues and on development of this country. I want to come back to the bill, Mr. Speaker, although I couldn't but respond to those terrible allegations made by the member opposite who had really not baseless allegations that were irrelevant to the bill but needed to be addressed. The Associate Minister for Small Business asks what I know about small business. I had the privilege of growing up in a family where my father and mother were both involved in businesses, Mr. Banks, and I have also acted as a contractor on occasions. But that member there knows a lot about brown bags, brown envelopes with money in them that he has taken and the police say was not a legal action, and I don't think that is appropriate for a Minister of Small Business. I don't think that's in any way appropriate. But I come back to the bill, Mr. Speaker. They keep drawing me away. This is the bill developed by the Minister of Novapay. We've got to ask ourselves whether it's been virtually tested. That's right. Yeah. Or whether it's been trialled in parallel to other legislation. Because as one WAG earlier commented today, that the virtual testing of Novapay has only led to virtual pay at the end. Inadequate legislation. This bill here, we would hope, will produce better outcomes. Because this is actually useful legislation, Mr. Speaker. This is useful legislation, and we must compliment the government when, on the odd occasion, it brings useful legislation to this House. This legislation won't set the world on fire, but it will address some important issues. The general policy statement for this bill tells us that the objective that the government is trying to address here is to provide information to external users who have a need for an entity's financial statements but are unable to demand them. We can't fault that. We can't fault that as an objective of a financial reporting system. And the three factors when financial reporting is in the public interest are public accountability, so that's about transparency at its most basic, where the public have a vested interest. And the examples that are cited in the legislation are those where an entity is effectively owned by taxpayers or ratepayers, where they've sought funding through debt or equity instruments offered to the public, where they take deposits from the public or hold assets in a fiduciary capacity, or where they receive donations and bequests. Mr. Banks might take a call shortly to tell us a little more about that particular issue of transparency.
Come on, brown bag.
We'll be interested to hear what he has to say on that matter, as I'm sure the courts will in December.
You can't remember.
So transparency is the first issue where financial reporting is in the public interest. The second is where it has economic significance. And this could be understood as size matters, Mr. Speaker. Because when large entities fail, it does have an impact on local and regional economies. And so we can understand why it is important that there is objective financial statements put out in cases where there is that wider public interest. And the final reason given in principle is about separation. And it's where owners of a business ought to be able to have decent financial statements that relate to their business, where they're not managing the entity itself.
That's right.
So these principles are all sound principles, and the aim of this bill is to give them effect. The three major outcomes we're told this bill achieves is that it reduces compliance costs where they're unnecessary costs. These are my words, not the bill's words, Mr. Speaker, you understand. But I want to support that. We need to ensure that compliance costs are dropped where they're not necessary, not like in the paperboy tax. And one of the things that's being added here is that shareholders will make the call with small companies about whether those reporting standards are needing to be met in a verifiable way or not, according to their own need. And so that's reducing unnecessary compliance. In some ways, this bill will also increase some compliance costs. We're told the second thing that this bill achieves is to make sure that the law is strengthened where the current reporting requirements do not adequately meet users' needs. Now, we haven't heard much from the government about increasing compliance costs, although that is one thing this bill will achieve in some circumstances. But actually, in some circumstances, that's a good thing. Where that compliance is producing an outcome that is of value to the wider public, where it's in the interest of transparency for the public who have a vested interest, or where it's in the case of an entity that has economic significance in a region or in a location, or where it's about providing accountability to owners that they don't otherwise have. Can you imagine if we had proper, good regulation around the companies that failed in the global financial crisis? We actually had transparent and clear reporting that was in the interests of those stakeholders that had their money invested. We may never have got to the position as a world that we've got to as a result of the global financial crisis. And the general point here is, of course, that markets make good servants. Good, efficient markets make good servants. They use capital efficiently and allocate it well in the interests of the wider public and in the interests of economic development and social good that's derived from that. And poorly regulated servants make bad masters. Poorly regulated markets make bad masters. And where we don't have effective and efficient regulation, we either get unnecessary costs or we get markets that are left without the kinds of transparency that ensure that the public good is met alongside them. The third thing we're told this bill achieves is it will make, I quote here from the introductory statement, it will make several other changes where the current financial reporting settings are inconsistent with the three indicators of financial reporting. That's the third major outcome of this bill. Now, I think that's actually probably more of a sundry item than a major achievement of the bill, Mr. Speaker. And so those things, though, are all worthwhile. The regulatory impact statement tells us that this bill has not yet been widely consulted upon, and that's consistent with what the government's done so far, and often to the detriment of legislation introduced to this House. However, my colleague Mr. Parker pointed out earlier that there is an intention to have a full and proper select committee process which will bring appropriate scrutiny, and that will improve the bill. And I congratulate the government on making sure that there is a full and transparent process from here on in around the bill to make these important changes that will make our regulation as efficient and appropriate as possible. And Mr. Speaker, if I can just finish with a brief indication of some of the changes that will be included for a company. They won't be prepared to require small medium enterprise statements in accordance with the financial reporting standards issued by the XRB. There will be no requirement to prepare parent accounts if group accounts are prepared. Audit legally required to follow auditing standards issued by the XRB. These are all changes that are made that will affect individual companies. And there are a series. There's a table that I've seen prepared which has a large number of changes that are made in this bill that will affect companies directly, that will affect limited partnerships, that will affect reporting entities, industrial and provident societies, building societies, credit unions. It'll be interesting to see what these entities have to say about the new reporting requirements, whether the building societies and credit unions feel they're being overly regulated or whether this is appropriate as it stands. So I congratulate the Minister on introducing this important legislation. I hope it's more successful than the NovaPay debacle that he's overseeing, because we need good regulation in this country.
Speaker. Sam Lodoinga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.